I would like to record 3 small videos called Jazz Saxophone versus Classical Saxophone. The first of these videos has to be a little bit of history, and it was inspired by when I was in the train. I had internet connection, and I did look of a show on the internet which was dedicated to someone who wanted to promote the classical saxophone. I think this is great, because the classical saxophone needs people like this, especially if they play well. We did that for some long time ago. It started with Sigurd Wascher, Marcel Mühl, Jean-Marie Londex, Frédéric Hempé, and name it. Eugène Rousseau, of course, and I made maybe a little contribution too. So this was an effort, but some of those players, they had a kind of a negative attitude to jazz. I'm sorry to say that, but most of them, it was maybe also because they could not play jazz. So the history of the saxophone is true that it was invented before jazz. It's absolutely correct. But the piano also was invented before the appearance of jazz music. Trumpet also, clarinet also. So why the saxophone was taken over by jazz musicians? First of all, the saxophone was not invented for classical music, as said in this show. It was not invented for jazz, of course, also. It was invented for military music. And this military music consisted out of brass instruments and woodwind instrument, flute and clarinet, and then it needed a transition between the woodwinds and the brass, and that was the idea of Adolf Sax, to make instrument out of brass who had a woodwind kind of sound. And in that time there was mostly used in military bands. Adolf Sax was a professor at the Conservatoire in Paris in the military section, special military section, not like Marcel Mühl. And it was very few works written for saxophone until about 1900 and somethings. And it was very few times used in the symphonic orchestra, Massenet, Meyerbeer, Bizet, and that's about all who comes to my mind. There's a few others, but not many. And so actually, it was the jazz musicians who did take the instrument and made it famous. And if we would not have the jazz musician who did this, the saxophone would have simply disappeared, maybe. So we should be thankful to the jazz musician and respect them. And now coming to the sound. The sound of Adolf saxophone has nothing to do with the sound of a modern saxophone. I can tell you that because I owned Adolf Sax saxophone and played with a wooden mouthpiece, and some of my colleagues did too. And they can tell you this is a completely different aesthetic, completely different sound as we use today. Actually, what we use today has nearly more relation to a jazz sound as the Adolf sax sound, which is perpetuated by some follower of Sigurd Rascher, who play old saxophones from 60, 70 years ago, or imitation of them, and you can hear a big difference, in the concept of sound. Also in the last 60 years, the French building of saxophone did evaluate much, and it's you can have an opinion if this is good or not. And this is the saxophones now are better of the one, the Mark VI were better, or the earlier saxophone, Sigurd Kutter and whatever. But I mean, they have all different characteristics of sound, like pianos, like a Steinway or a Bösendorfer, or a Yamaha, or clarinets, buffet clarinet, German clarinets, the bassoon, German fagots, the French bassoons, the buffet bassoons. They are all different instruments and have different characteristics. And they can be used in a different way. Now, I think people who tell me that the saxophone was in first time, his position was a classical instrument, I cannot accept that. It should be, but it's not. I hope it will integrate more and more, and it does actually. And it does because of the efforts of the generation before. Not because of the people who now exploit some things who's already nearly done. But it's not done. It still has a long way to go. The reason is probably the music was written for the saxophone. We have no big works like the clarinet, like the flute, like the bassoon, like all other woodwinds. It's missing in our literature. And of course the public, they want to listen first the works. They don't want absolutely to listen an instrument. On the other hand, you have also to say that when a saxophonist plays and he's very good, it always does a big success. So now coming to the fact of the sound. Then I heard some negative comments of the sounds to the sound. And I think that is not a thing to do. Because that brings us back to the time who was even racism against jazz musicians who were mostly Afro-Americans, and who actually did in history the greatest musical event of the 20th century. Their sounds is different than the so-called classical sound. But the interesting thing is when a composer comes to a classical saxophone player and works with him, his work, and suddenly he says, yes, but here I would like to have a little bit of more jazzy sound, not French or so. And then saxophone player, the classical saxophone player, tries, and then it comes out like a terrible honk and really ugly. That means this player is not able to produce any kind of jazzy sound. So to produce jazzy sound actually must be not so easy to have a good jazz sound. Then the other difference, there is very few saxophone players which I personally can recognize right away. There is like one, like Nobuya Sugawa, which I think I can recognize right away. But there's not few others. But I can recognize Stan Getz on the first note. I can recognize John Coltrane on the first note. I can recognize Charlie Parker on the first note. And I could name it and name it, because they all have a very personal sound and not an aesthetically bound sound, not imitating a cello or another classical instrument. So, making the jazz sound of saxophone kind of negative thing, it's not correct. There is saxophone players in both styles, classical and jazz, who have very beautiful and good qualities of sounds, and in both styles there are some who are not, they not have this ability to really produce really a very nice and good sound. This is valid for jazz and for classical. So this is actually all about this story about the sound, and I would just like to demonstrate this with some jazz and classical saxophone players who I think they are both playing with great sounds. They're very different, and some like it, some don't like it. Comments are welcome. I just can tell you I love both.